From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I am Soini Gray. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has lost his latest appeal to have his UK arrest warrant overturned. That means Assange will face detention if he leaves the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he's been confined for more than 5 years. Assange's lawyers argued that the punishment does not match the crime. But the judge said Assange should have the courage to face the consequences of his choices. He skipped bail in 2012 to avoid being extradited to Sweden over allegations of sexual assault and rape. Sweden has since dropped the investigation. Assange said he's surprised by the judge's ruling. He tweeted a statement saying the judge went outside what was presented in court, leading to what he called factual errors in the judgment. He says the United States still wants to arrest him. Assange has 3 months to appeal. Our correspondent in London, Pablo Neverati, has been following the case, and he sent this report.
In the past hour, a British court has announced that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has lost his latest bid to have his UK arrest warrant dropped. Mr. Assange's lawyers argued that the warrant issued in 2012 was no longer valid because an investigation into sex-related allegations had been dropped by the Swedish authorities. But in a ruling in Westminster Magistrates Court, Senior District Judge Emma Arbuthnot said it was in the public interest to pursue Mr. Assange for failing to answer bail at a police station as he fought extradition to Sweden. The founder of the whistleblower site WikiLeaks, Mr. Assange, argued he flouted the conditions out of his bail out of fear for being handed over to the US government to face an unfair trial for disclosing US government secrets, which he considers a public service. As it stands, Mr. Assange, who's been in the Ecuadorian embassy since 2012 in what the US considers to be an unreasonably arbitrary detention by the British authorities, would face arrest were he to step out of the embassy.
As you just heard, Assange is concerned that if he's arrested, he may be extradited to the US on espionage charges. Here's why.
All right, firing. Let me know when you have it. Light them all up. Come on, fire.
This video is called Collateral Murder.
Keep shooting.
It's one of the thousands of US classified documents released by WikiLeaks in 2010, showing the death of civilians at the hands of US forces.
Clear.
I believe that if those killings were lawful under the rules of engagement, then the rules of engagement are wrong. Deeply wrong.
The US condemned the move, calling WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service.
Assange and his ilk make common cause with dictators today. Yes, they try unsuccessfully to cloak themselves and their actions in the language of liberty and privacy, but in reality, they champion nothing but their own celebrity. Their currency is clickbait, their moral compass non-existent.
Despite the 8-year-long verbal campaign against Assange, the US has not launched a public criminal case against him. But that doesn't mean it won't. Just last year, US Attorney General Jeff Sessions said arresting Assange is a priority.
He needs an assurance that he will not be extradited to the United States to face prosecution. And the use of the United States, or the attempted use to abuse espionage laws, to silence public interest publishing and revealing true information in the public interest, is a grave threat to free speech that all of us and every state should be resisting.
The problem is that the UK says it cannot grant Assange that assurance, and that's why Assange has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for more than 5 years, sparking humanitarian protests.
The working group maintains the arbitrary detention of Mr. Assange should be brought to an end, and his physical integrity and his freedom of movement should be respected.
Assange and his supporters applauded the ruling, but it has done little to set him free.
Today, is an important victory for me and for the UN human rights system. But it by no means erases 7 years of detention without charge.
Ecuador has been a steady supporter of Assange, offering asylum and then citizenship in December.
He had been a person under international protection for about 5.5 years under the jurisdiction of the Ecuadorian state and its embassy in London. The naturalization was granted on December 12, 2017.
Unfortunately for Assange, the British authorities refused to accept that Ecuadorian nationality gives him any protection.
Opponents of Venezuela's Bolivarian government are stepping up international pressure. The Lima Group of Latin American countries, including Brazil, Argentina and Mexico, have been discussing Venezuela's decision to call a presidential election in April. The group is expected to release a joint statement in the coming hour after they've evaluated what the Peruvian foreign minister called measures to be taken over Venezuela's political situation. And earlier, our correspondent in Lima, Jaime Herrera, sent this report.
Several Latin American countries, part of the Lima Group, are having a meeting today to discuss Venezuela's decision to hold a presidential election on April 22nd. However, it is not a coincidence that the Lima Group gathered together a few days after the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and OAS General Secretary Luis Almagro to several countries of the region. During his visit to Mexico, Rex Tillerson asked the Venezuelan government to stop the government of President Nicolás Maduro from having national elections. The U.S. President, Donald Trump, also made comments about having a military intervention in Venezuela. Meanwhile, social movements in Venezuela have rejected the Lima Group meeting. They said international groups should focus on other countries where democracy has been attacked, such as Brazil and Honduras, and to have a debate about human rights violations in the United States. Here in Peru, a few social groups are demanding the Lima Group discuss the political situation in this country and talk about the government's corruption cases. We are expecting an official announcement at the end of the meeting.
Now, a number of countries, including the United States and Colombia, have already said they will not recognize Venezuela's presidential election on April 22nd. In Venezuela, however, people are demanding that their decision to go to the polls be respected. Laura Prada has more.
Venezuela is heading towards elections. Laughter, songs and joy are the worst threats facing the public as they go to parks to enjoy these days of carnival with their family. The people's message is clear.
That this will all get fixed, or start to be fixed after the elections. All we're looking for is tranquility and to leave behind this conflict we have seen.
One of these conflicts is the economic war the country is going through, due to an economic blockade and sanctions imposed by the United States since last year. However, people like Joanna and Robert are banking on peace.
We are happy because we are going to win again, because there's support for us, for our children. What we want is peace and joy.
My contribution is to support these children and, of course, to support the revolution. What else? And to thank the government for the support it has given us.
Despite these calls from the government and ordinary people for peace and dialogue, there are still voices calling for a military humanitarian intervention and trying to prevent the election.
They will have to demonstrate to the Venezuelan people whether they really have commitment to democracy. As they say, all the electoral guarantees are in place. If they decide not to participate, then they must be thinking about an alternative to dialogue, peace, and coexistence.
The polling agency Interlaces estimates that 69% of the population will exercise its right to vote, numbers which confirm that Venezuelans want to live in peace. Laura Prada, Telesur Caracas.
The Cuban government has rejected a declaration by the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, that Cuba is, quote, the worst kind of dictatorship. Almagro made the statement at an event in the Cuban Museum in Miami over the weekend. He also said the world cannot accept an undemocratic succession in Cuba. Raul Castro will step down as Cuba's president on April 19th. Cuba's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rogelio Sierra Diaz, told reporters the Secretary General has no right to judge the Cuban government and the people.
The
OAS Secretary General has got no credibility or moral authority to criticize our government and our people. He's made a grave mistake by ignoring Cuba's decision to be a sovereign and independent state. We categorically reject his statement and recognize them as meddlesome. Cuba will continue to walk its own path. We will remain unbowed, opposing the wishes of submissive and craving individuals such as the Secretary General.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. Members of Colombia's Revolutionary Alternative Forces of the Commons, or FARC, are calling for a pact of non-violence during the Colombian election campaign. Last week, the FARC temporarily suspended its campaign because of threats against its candidates. Their statement says, "We signed the agreements in Havana on the understanding that with their implementation, conditions would be met to generate reforms historically demanded by Colombian society. We have completely fulfilled the pact, and despite failures to fully implement the agreement, we decided to take part in the current election. However, the restrictions and limitations are obvious. We have been forced to temporarily suspend our electoral campaign. This will continue until we see a significant change in these circumstances." Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office has issued an arrest warrant for 21 members of the National Liberation Army, or ELN. This includes Pablo Beltran, the chief negotiator for the armed group in the peace talks with the government. According to a statement issued by the judicial authority, the ELN members are accused of forced displacement and rebellion. 4 other commanders are subject to arrest, and 9 members have already been detained. Peace talks were suspended in January after rebels attacked 3 police stations.
We're investigating criminal operations against civilians with 27 new investigations in 8 departments of the country. We're investigating the violent actions against the population, road infrastructure and public forces that took place over the last 3 days. 9 people were arrested in connection to violent acts so far.
Our correspondent, Jose Manuel Jimenez, has more.
The armed strike decreed by the ELN since February 10th has come to an end, with no deaths. The Attorney General's office has issued an arrest warrant for leaders of the ELN, among them Nicolás Rodríguez Bautista, Antonio Garcia, and Pablo Beltrán, whose arrest warrant is suspended since he is the chief negotiator of the ELN in Quito. Arrest warrants have been also issued for Gustavo Aníbal Giraldo, better known as Pablito, and the head of the Western War Front, Ángel Padilla Romero. Meanwhile, the government continues to discuss with its negotiator, Gustavo Bell, over the option they have to reactivate the dialogue between the ELN and the national government. Various political parties have written a letter to the ELN urging them to agree a bilateral ceasefire as fast as possible, and therefore reactivate the negotiations. What we have to highlight here are the victims, the campesinos, indigenous, the Afro-descendant population that have suffered from the military actions by all armed groups, especially since the escalation by the government forces in the last couple of weeks, which makes it harder for the inhabitants of the regions like Catatumbo, Chocó, and Buenaventura. Society has called for a 5th round of negotiations and that peace may triumph.
And earlier I spoke to Richard McCall, a peace conflict specialist and journalist based in Bogota. And I asked him where the ELN ceasefire negotiations are left now in light of the new arrest warrants for the commanders.
Well, it's going to be very hard for the government to come to any agreement to reach the table again for this 5th round of talks. The reality is that President Santos has incredibly low approval ratings, and he won't be wanting to be seen as a weak president and to go back and sort of meet the guerrillas on their own terms in Quito.
To Mexico now, where 8 bodies were found in a mass grave in the state of Nayarit, specifically in an area known as Cerro Los Coyotes. The graves were discovered near an area where 2 other pits with 33 bodies were found in January. The bodies have not been identified. Investigators believe that they've been buried for nearly 6 months. Former Guatemalan President Alberto Colom and Finance Minister Juan Alberto Fuentes have been arrested. Fuentes is currently chairman of Oxfam International, the British aid agency currently facing scrutiny after revelations that its aid workers hired prostitutes in Haiti in 2011. Both men have been arrested as part of a local corruption investigation. Colom was the president of Guatemala from 2008 to 2012. A mud volcano erupted twice in South Trinidad on Tuesday morning. Homes were evacuated in Devil's Woodyard in New Grant, where the volcanoes are located. The first happened around 4 on Tuesday morning, and the second, which you're seeing in this video, happened around 9 Trinidad time. Mud volcanoes happen because of movement of the earth, but they do not produce lava and are not driven by volcanic activity. We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting on.
Maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other.
Welcome back. South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, has ordered President Jacob Zuma to stand down as head of state. The ANC wants the new party leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, to replace Zuma as president. The ANC General Secretary explained the party's position in a news conference.
When we recall our deployee, we expect our deployee to do what the organization expects him to do. So I don't know what will happen, but let's leave it to President Jacob Zuma. Timelines, no, we were not going to him, but I think the NEC believes that this is an Asian matter, so it must be treated with agency.
Israeli police have found enough evidence to recommend charging Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with bribery and fraud in 2 corruption cases. Police evidence shows that for 9 years, Netanyahu received expensive gifts from a few supporters, and in return, he pushed for the so-called Milchan law, which ensures that Israelis who return to live in Israel from abroad are exempt from paying taxes for 10 years. Netanyahu has denied the accusations and says he's the victim of a witch hunt by left-wing opponents. The U.S. President Donald Trump is proposing to increase military spending from $74 billion to $716 billion. This would be the biggest military budget the United States has seen since 2011. It comes as part of Trump's new spending plans, which also include more money for homeland security and anti-immigration measures, while food and health programs for the poor are cut.
Everyone in America.
The U.S. Senate has begun a major free-for-all immigration debate, its first in nearly 5 years. It could decide the fate of 700,000 Dreamer immigrants, young people brought into the country without papers years ago as children, under an order issued last year by Republican President Donald Trump. The Dreamers could be deported after March 5th. On Sunday, New York's Attorney General sued the Weinstein Company and Harvey Weinstein, alleging his years of sexual assault and misconduct by the movie mogul created an unsafe workspace. The move could jeopardize talks on the potential sale of Miramax Studio, which Weinstein co-founded. He was one of Hollywood's most influential men before more than 70 women accused him of sexual misconduct. And now let's have a look at some other stories making headlines around the world.
Thousands of mourners have attended funeral prayers for Pakistani human rights campaigner Asma Jahangir. Jahangir faced death threats for fighting for unpopular causes and was jailed in the 1980s for her pro-democracy work during military rule. She died at the age of 66 on Sunday. Thousands of women have taken to the streets of Afrin in northern Syria to protest against Turkey's military campaign in the region. Protesters held banners and chanted, "Erdogan is the killer of civilians," as they marched down Afrin streets, 25 days after the start of Campaign Olive Branch.
Today, the women of Afrin protest against Turkish war attacks and the terrorists who support it. Today, women decide their fate again. As women lead the revolution, women will also lead a way out of this crisis.
Pro-Kurdish activists have occupied the German Social Democrats Party, or SPD, headquarters in Hamburg to protest against German weapons exports to Turkey. The activists held banners from the balcony and called for an end to arms exports to Turkey, a withdrawal of weapons permits, and a lifting of the ban on the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Yemeni children have protested outside the United Nations building in Sana'a to demand a stop to the war and a return to regular food and aid supplies into the country. According to a UNICEF report released earlier this year, over 5,000 children have been killed or injured in the conflict.
We can come to demand that the United States stop the attacks on Yemen so we can go back to our schools. Saudi Arabia says it sends us flour and wheat, but it sends us missiles. They bomb their houses, mosques, and everything else.
Hundreds of people in Morocco have flooded the streets in the northeastern city of Jarada, outraged by a string of deaths in collapsed closed mines. Earlier this month, one illegal miner was killed and another injured after an abandoned mine collapsed on top of them. Locals are calling the mines of death, since hundreds of people risk their lives every day digging in dangerous conditions.
Mardi Gras festivities are underway in New Orleans, Louisiana. Thousands of people have taken to the streets for a day of parades, parties, and music. Mardi Gras, also known as Fat Tuesday, is the last day of the carnival, devoted to partying the final hours before Ash Wednesday, which begins the Lenten season of sacrifice in the Catholic faith. We've come to the end of this news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website at tellusyourtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Your English, I'm Sweeney Gray. Thank you so much for watching.